Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, so still just working through the visible and the invisible, chapter 3. This is the last video for this chapter, Interrogation and Intuition. And I've broken it up into two parts, language and beyond essence and fusion. So let's jump into the first part, language. So we're still on this topic of coincidence. Intuition understood as a fusion or a coincidence with the thing, with the past, but the idea that understanding being requires a fusion with the thing or the past, or into this into a greater totality. So with that in mind, Merleau-Ponty notes that if coincidence is the goal, if fusion is the goal, language will always be deceptive, because it will always be an obstacle between us and the things, or between us and the past. And that's just because of the nature of language, what language is. It naturally and unavoidably creates distance between us and the thing, because we're now talking about the thing. So there is an inevitable distance associated, a distancing aspect to language. But a fusion is the truth. A fusion is where we understand being, and it's what being is the core of being, if you like, and we can only understand being through fusion. Then language is always going to be an obstacle always an obstacle like that. So if truth is coincidence, it will always be beyond words. And then Merleau-Ponty gives us this quote: "But yet everything comes to pass as though he, the philosopher, wished to put into words a certain silence he hearkens to within himself. His entire work is this absurd effort. He wrote in order to state his contact with being. He did not state it and could not state it, since it is silence. Then he recommences." So there's a bit of a backstory with this quote, because this is something which it's the exact same idea that Bergson raised and I think this was in The Creative Mind, one of the essays he wrote after Creative Evolution. But the context is a little bit different from the way that Merleau-Ponty is using it here. So anyway, Bergson, when he said this, and he said almost exactly this, you have this, in order to understand duration, you have to imagine yourself, you have to imagine reality from, in a way, from the perspective of duration. You have to change the way you think about reality. You have to put yourself into the shoes, if you like, of duration. And the idea, though, is that Bergson is talking about, so first he's talking about metaphysical reality, and he's trying to overcome our parts-based way of thinking in order to get to the whole, in order to understand metaphysical reality as a whole. And so language then, so you have this insight, this understanding, not mystical. I don't think Bergson had anything mystical in mind here. This is not kind of, it's not fusion, it's not intuition as fusion, but it's a complete reorientation in the way that you're thinking, in the way that you're approaching this subject. And so you have this insight first, Bergson says, and then you try and translate it into words. And that always fails, because words and language are a product and a feature of parts-based thinking. They've evolved out of our own evolution in the world. And when you're trying to understand the world itself as a whole, the methods and the processes that have evolved within the world are going to break down. And language is one of those things. So you try and translate or convert your understanding into this imperfect medium, language, and you never quite succeed. It doesn't quite work. So you do it once, it's not quite right, so you do it again, you recommence, try it again, and again it's not quite right, so you do it again, and it's this never-ending attempt to explicate the inexplicable, basically. And that's what Bergson Bergson didn't use the word silence, I don't think, but that's what he means when he used this idea, that you're always trying to convert something into a tool. You're trying to understand something using a tool that is not the right tool for the job. So that was what he meant when he used this idea. Merleau-Ponty, however, so it had nothing to do with coincidence or fusion in the way that Merleau-Ponty's thinking. The way that Merleau-Ponty intends this quote is that if truth is coincidence or fusion, it's silence. It's an experience. It's something that can only be felt, if you like. And therefore, language is useless. It's an absurd effort. Anytime you try and use it, it's going to fail, because the truth lies in some kind of fusion, some kind of merging with the thing. So that's not the way that Bergson intended it. So I'm ambivalent about Merleau-Ponty using this idea, because it's a clear reference back to Bergson, but the two have very different... the idea comes up in two very different contexts. So yeah, I don't know, it makes perfect sense for Merleau-Ponty. It's just that it's connected back to Bergson in a way that I think misses. It makes it sound like there's an implied critique of Bergson, but that critique misses the mark for me. On the other hand, there is a good kind of, it does point to a difference in thought between Merleau-Ponty and Bergson, and that is that for Bergson, language was still an obstacle. It was, like I said, it was the wrong tool for the job, but it's the only tool we have, so we have to use it. For Merleau-Ponty, however, he wants to get away from that idea that language is an obstacle. And as we work through this section, we'll see exactly why that's the case. So it does point to a good point of difference between the two. But there's a little problem with that as well, because Bergson was doing metaphysics, Merleau-Ponty's doing ontology, and it's even that critique misses the mark for that reason. But that aside, if we ignore that, that's kind of a key point here, which Merleau-Ponty will flesh out, or I will flesh out through Merleau-Ponty as we go through. So Merleau-Ponty goes on to wonder, if truth isn't coincidence, how can language be used? What is it about language that makes it adequate in his eyes for talking about being? It would be a language of which he, the philosopher, would not be the organizer. Words he would not assemble, that would combine through him by virtue of a natural intertwining of their meaning through the occult trading of the metaphor, where what counts is no longer the manifest meaning of each word and of each image, but the lateral relations, the kinships that are implicated in their transfers and their exchanges. It is indeed a language of this sort that Bergson himself required for the philosopher. So this is Merleau-Ponty's point. It isn't impossible to use language to understand or communicate being. He says somewhere else, Language is not necessarily deceptive. So language is the right tool for the job for Merleau-Ponty here. And how is it the right tool? Through the use of metaphor, through words that and images that don't translate one-to-one. That if language is not treated as a system of signs where each sign refers to one signified. I'm talking language that Derrida would use, but still, that's the point. If language isn't used in that way, it's not understood in that way, then it becomes useful. It becomes the appropriate tool to understand being. And we've talked about this before. If language, because Merleau-Ponty says language is not this kind of system, it's not a system of signs where you can just with one-to-one relations to meanings, then rather than simply codifying what we already know, language helps us to think in the first place. It is creative. It's the working out of thought itself. And it's this way, it's in this sense that language is useful, that language can be used. It's the right tool for the job. And there's a fantastic quote in one of Merleau-Ponty's essays, I think, or taken from one of his lecture courses. I'm not sure exactly where the quote comes from. It's from Derrida, actually. Derrida quotes Merleau-Ponty in Writing Indifference. But the quote is this: "My own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think." I love that quote. It just captures this idea that language isn't a fixed code. It's not something we don't have our thoughts all organized and arranged and then have to find a medium to express them, which is how we usually think of language. Rather, language itself is how we think. We think in terms of, or our thinking is only possible through language. So language is as creative as thinking. If we think our thoughts are creative, then language is exactly the same thing, because we think through language. But I really like that. That just resonates so strongly with me. My own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think. And I've had that experience many times when I'm writing. Often ideas that I didn't have beforehand come up in the course of writing. In the course of putting them down on paper, my ideas change sometimes, or, like I say, original ideas come forward that I didn't have beforehand. So it's writing language is not simply taking what's already complete and full and merely trying to transfer it through this medium to someone else. It's language is more creative or more originary than this. So he says the speaker is not the organizer, the assembler of language. Rather, it combines through him or her. And Heidegger said something similar before Merleau-Ponty. Derrida says something similar afterwards. But it's the creative, revealing capacity that language has. Not as something independent of us, but as a part of us, a part of who we are, a part of Dasein, Heidegger would say. And it's in that way that language can be used to talk about being. And so if we continue this thinking of this about this idea, since language is like this, since it isn't a code, a system of signs, since it is creative in this way, it's something that it's the way that we think, then the philosopher knows better than anyone that what is lived spoken, that born at this depth, language is not a mask over being, but if one knows how to grasp it with all its roots and all its foliation, the most valuable witness to being, that it does not interrupt in a mediation that would be perfect without it. So here is that idea come to the fore. Language is not an obstacle. Rather, if one uses it properly, it is the very revealing of being. As Merleau-Ponty says, the most valuable witness to being. So there are two things I wanted to point out here. What does properly mean? First, it means not understood the way linguistics sees it. That is, as I've said, a system of coding and decoding. As Merleau-Ponty says, a technical relation between a sound and a meaning, which are joined only by express convention. Rather, properly means the lived spoken, or as Merleau-Ponty says a little bit later on, the speaking word. And by this he doesn't mean to prioritize speaking over writing, but he means understanding the conventions of one's native language as something natural, as something that language is something one lives within. And he describes this quite nicely when he says it's the folding over of the visible and lived experience upon language, and vice versa. The folding over of language upon the visible and lived experience. And that is exactly what we just said before, language as the working out of thought itself, language as creative and originary. It's what our lives are enmeshed within language. It's not this abstract system of codes which we employ when we want to explain something. It's something deeper than that. It goes to the very core of what it is to be a human being, of how we live. What is lived spoken. It's lived and understood through language at this very primordial level. So language then is the revealing of being. It's not a mask over being, but it's the most valuable witness to being. And the idea here, I think, isn't just that we can use language to reveal being, but that being can only be revealed through language. Because without language, we wouldn't have this, there would be no being. Without language, language is a part of what makes us a part of the world, but special. That openness, it gives us that openness to being. It makes us a perspective upon being. So even though we are, and this is a core part of what Merleau-Ponty is saying, we are fully enmeshed in the world, in being. We are in being not like other objects. We're in being as we're in the world as this perspective that also opens up onto the world. And part of the way it opens up is through language. So without language, there would be no possibility of even talking about being. So it's just more intrinsic to our understanding of being than we typically think. It's not a tool that we use. We don't exist first and then use language as a tool to talk about being. Rather, we exist through language in the first place. It makes up an essential aspect. It is an essential aspect of who we are. And Heidegger said it much the same way within quite a nice framework of Dasein, because a part of Dasein is discourse. It's not that you have this complete being which then discourses, the discourse is a part of what that being is. And essentially that's what Merleau-Ponty is saying here. Language is not a tool, it's a part of who we are, and that makes it the most valuable witness to being, the revealing of being itself. Okay, so let's move on to the second part, beyond essence and fusion. So searching for being in essences or fusion are two similar errors. Commit two similar errors, Merleau-Ponty says. In the search for essences, one is concerned with statements, trusting in speech absolutely, flattening philosophy to the plane of ideality. And this gives us an infinite distance. It places us infinitely beyond or at a remove from being, which we saw when we talked about ourselves as pure spectators. In fusion, one is concerned with the silence of things, distrusting speech absolutely, and flattening philosophy to the plane of existence. And this brings us into an absolute proximity. And both of these are wrong for Merleau-Ponty. And they're similar, I guess similar in form. They're similar in the sense that they concern the same, they make the same kind of errors, but at opposite ends of the spectrum. The search for essences belongs to speech, belongs to ideality. Seeing, trying to understand being in terms of fusion, distrusts speech and brings us to the plane of existence, but both at these extremes which make them untenable. What is needed essentially is a midway point. That is, and by that I mean a distance, but a distance that doesn't place us at an infinite remove from being. That every being presents itself at a distance which does not prevent us from knowing it, which is, on the contrary, the guarantee for knowing it. This is what is not considered. That the presence of the world is precisely the presence of its flesh to my flesh. That I am of the world and that I am not it. This is what is no sooner said than forgotten. Metaphysics remains coincidence. So the big thing there, distance is important. It's not just important, but it's the guarantee for knowing being. Without it, being cannot appear at all. But it's a distance which at the same time keeps me in mind, keeps the questioner in mind. So a distance that gives me the space, if you like, creates the space for being to appear, but doesn't generate so much space that it appears as something over there, removed from me. As Merleau-Ponty says, I am of the world. I am not it, however. I'm of the world, but I'm not the world. It's not a fusion into one thing. That gives us nothing. If there is only this fusion into one, then we lose being. There is no being. There's no revealing of being because there's no one to reveal to. There's no space anywhere in this wholeness for being to be revealed at all. And this is the meaning of flesh. This is the purpose of that word flesh. It's a metaphor which allows us to see how I and the world are connected. We're connected as flesh. If we understand the world being as flesh, then we have this natural connection because our bodies are flesh as well. So there is this natural intertwining of the two. But my body as flesh is obviously different from the world as flesh. So it preserves that distance that is so important. So we have then this connection. It brings up a connection between me and the world, while not forcing one to disappear into the other, which would be the mistake of fusion. And just note too the way that flesh, the word flesh, is precisely the use of language Merleau-Ponty was talking about earlier when he said the occult trading of the metaphor, using language in such a way that it holds open this way of thinking about reality, or this way of thinking about being or the world. So that's the important point there, distance, and Merleau-Ponty using language in this way that we've talked about. And the other thing I wanted to mention regarding that quote is the very end. Metaphysics remains coincidence. And perhaps this is why Merleau-Ponty, to my knowledge at least, never called his philosophy metaphysics, because he understands metaphysics as coincidence, metaphysics as thinking of reality as one. And that's probably the source of his criticisms towards Bergson, who always talked about reality as a whole, but who also never said reality as one. He also explicitly said that the idea of a oneness where everything is one and the same thing is mistaken. But I think this kind of gives us an insight into why, or Merleau-Ponty's disagreement with Bergson, that he sees metaphysics as a coincidence, a fusing, a merging into one perfect, harmonious whole that is identical with itself. So that was interesting, I thought, to note. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about in this part is the interrogative, just coming back to this idea of interrogation. The appropriate entry point to being for Merleau-Ponty is through interrogation. The interrogative is an original manner of aiming at something, as it were a question knowing, which by principle no statement or answer can go beyond, and which perhaps therefore is the proper mode of our relationship with being. What do I know is not only what is knowing, and not only who am I, but finally what is there, and even what is the there is. These questions call not for the exhibiting of something said which would put an end to them, but for the disclosure of a being that is not posited because it has no need to be, because it is silently behind all our affirmations, negations, and even behind all formulated questions. So our proper relationship to being is through a questioning, but a questioning that cannot be answered definitively. And that's because being is not something that can be posited. It just isn't that kind of thing. It's not negativity or positivity or essence or fusion or nothingness or being or emptiness or substance or any other idea that can be posited. Because as soon as you posit that thing, you're already positing it from a position of being. So to posit the thing is to already have missed the thing that you're trying to grasp. To posit being as this thing is to have already missed being, which is over here, which allows that positing to take place in the first place. So you're just coming to the party too late. That's an expression I've used before and I like. Being is always posited in every positing, and it's even posited in the questioning, right? It's even a questioning is still coming from a place. It's coming from being. It's being questioned. The question is arising within being already. So again, has missed it in a sense. But I think what's important here is that questions are naturally open-ended and can be kept that way. That's what Merleau-Ponty means when he says there's no answer. You can't give a definitive answer to this question, because as soon as you do that, you try and lock being into something. You try and posit it as something. But being will always escape that fixed definition, that box that you try and put it into. And that's the problem with affirmations or negations, statements of any kind. They are closed. They kind of lock us into this one position, whereas questions, although also arising from out of being, are open. And they, like I say, they can be held open and kept open if we are aware of that, and if we deliberately refrain from trying to give an answer, trying to close down the inquiry. And so, being is, our entry point to being is through the interrogative. And that brings us to our summary. So first up, language. If truth is coincidence, language will always be deceptive. Language can never enable fusion because by definition, it creates some space, creates distance between us and the thing we are talking about. So if truth is coincidence, if it's fusion, then language always is always a problem. It's always an obstacle. But language is also the working out of thought itself. And this is where Merleau-Ponty talks about the way that it's not a system of signs. It's not a one-to-one relation between a sign and a signified, or a sign and a meaning. Rather, my own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think. Language actually is not this kind of code or system. It is this organic, dynamic process, a creative process through which thought arises. It's the working out of thought itself. And when we have that, when we understand that, then we can see that language is actually a witness to being. When it's used properly, when we have the right approach, language reveals being. So this is language not the way linguistics sees it, but as lived spoken, that expression Merleau-Ponty used. It's connected with who we are. Our very lives are lived in speech. And therefore, being can only be revealed through language. Without it, there is no grasp of being. It's that essential, that intrinsic. And then the second part, beyond essence and fusion. So essence we talked about as the absolute trust of speech. This gave us an infinite distance between us and being. And fusion was the opposite of this, the absolute distrust of speech, generating an absolute proximity. Both similar errors in form, but at opposite, opposing ends of the spectrum. Rather, we looked for a midway point, and that is to say a distance that doesn't remove us from being. And language is a part of this. It lets us articulate that distance without pulling us out of being completely. We saw the way Merleau-Ponty uses the word flesh to do this. It gives us a way to understand our being in the world, while at the same time not just being the same as other things in the world, or even the same as the world itself. And finally, the interrogative. And this is our proper relationship to being, Merleau-Ponty says. And this is because it brings us to being with the right frame of mind. Instead of closing down the inquiry, instead of trying to finish the investigation by positing being as a particular thing, interrogation is open-ended. It keeps us in that right frame of mind whereby being can never be enclosed within a box. As long as we remember that we approach being through a question, but it's a question that cannot be answered. And that brings us to the end of the video. So that's also the end of chapter 3. Next week, probably, we'll start the 4th chapter, the intertwining, the chiasm. Probably everybody's been waiting for that chapter. But the reason I could have just made a video on that chapter. That's kind of the positive aspect, I think, of the visible and the invisible. But I think it's important to really, in order to put that, any key idea to be understood properly has to be understood in context. And I think all of the work that we've put in, working through what we could maybe call the negative, the critical aspect of the visible and the invisible, sets us up for a fuller, more complete understanding, I think, of what Merleau-Ponty means with the intertwining or the chiasm. So anyway, that's where we're going for the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then.